We're told recovery is a private matter, that addiction is something you fix inside yourself, and once you're stable, you quietly return to normal life. I don't think that's true, because the same system that's defined addiction also defined what they mean by acceptable recovery and what it looks like. In this episode, we're going to argue that healing doesn't just stabilise you, it changes how you see power, control and connection. And this is the last of chapter 2. Next, we move to chapter 3, which is the natural urge to alter consciousness, where coping becomes intoxication and survival becomes something more complicated. And this is where we really start drilling down to the details. Okay, so this is part 22 of the video series, and we're still on chapter 2, the childhood of fog. Section 20, and I keep doing this, forgetting to open the book. Section 20, the seeds of resistance. Recovery didn't end the story, it redirected it. The energy that once went into surviving began to search for meaning. What started as vigilance evolved into intellect, and now turned outward again, towards the systems that teach people to fear themselves. I could no longer see addiction as personal failure. It was a social diagnosis, a mirror of culture. Once that realisation took root, resistance began. The same precision that once calibrated microscopes started dissecting power. At first it was academic, long nights tracing how systems define disorder, how words like normal become cages. Beneath the research was rage. The realisation that the world had punished my mother for her pain, rewarded my silence for my obedience, and nearly destroyed me for coping in the only ways I'd been taught. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. The work drew me back to the communities that once kept me alive. Travellers, ravers, squatters, and the small autonomous zones where cooperation replaced competition. I began to see that the impulse behind every free festival was the same as the impulse behind mutual aid, people rehearsing equality in the ruins of hierarchy. Those sites were laboratories too, but of a different kind, experiments in solidarity rather than control. In practical anarchy, I call them temporary zones of truth, moments where people remember they can self-organise without permission. It wasn't nostalgia, it was continuity. The festival fields and the research labs were both about pattern recognition. One mapped frequencies, the other mapped behaviours. Both searched for coherence beneath the noise. Addiction had been a pattern too, repetition as anaesthetic. Resistance was the same motion, inverted. Repetition as intention. Every act of mutual care, every refusal to obey, became a small correction to the data of my past. Professional success had disguised the wound. Activism revealed it. When I began speaking publicly about addiction as trauma, colleagues sometimes winced, as though I'd breached decorum. Academia loves distance and mistrusts confession. But I'd learnt that the line between personal and political was the very thing that sustains silence. Harry argues that the opposite of addiction is connection. I would add that the opposite of control is transparency. To speak plainly is to refuse the system's preferred dialect of abstraction. Resistance also meant compassion for authorities' casualties. Not only the addicted and the marginalised, but the bureaucrats, clinicians and cops trapped inside their own machinery. Perry M. Winfrey described healing as the shift from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. The same question transforms politics. Once we ask what happened to us as a society, what fears, what separations, the blame economy collapses. What remains is shared responsibility. Science, paradoxically, became the language through which I could express that empathy. Measurement no longer felt like control, it became conversation. The instruments I'd once used to defend against uncertainty now mapped it with curiosity. That shift mirrored my own recovery. From mastery to understanding, from certainty to dialogue, the child who measured danger had become the adult who measures systems of care. By the time I wrote One Flew into the Cuckoo's Nest, the line was clear. Trauma breeds vigilance. vigilance breeds intellect. Intellect without compassion becomes management. Add compassion and it becomes liberation. The seed of resistance is empathy made structural. Anarchism at heart is not chaos but trust, the radical belief that people, given space and support, will act with integrity. The belief that belief grew from watching my own body learn to self-regulate once fear subsided. The same principle scales a nervous system. Sorry, getting a bit emotional there about my own recovery. Same principle scales a nervous system and a community both heal through connection. Now, when I talk about drugs, I no longer mean only substances. I mean every mechanism by which society manages discomfort. Money, work, TV, social media, the news, voting, obedience. The antidote to addiction is the same as the antidote to tyranny. Attention without fear. That's what the child in the fog was looking for all along. It just took decades and a few detours to name it. The next chapter begins where those threads meet, in the first true intoxications, when chemical relief becomes political revelation, when pleasure and rebellion speak the same language. What began as survival will become celebration. So up next is chapter 3, which is the natural urge to alter consciousness, which will argue that the drive to change our state of mind is not a moral flaw, but an evolutionary inheritance. Across species, organisms experiment with awareness. In humans, this impulse shaped ritual, art, bonding, and culture. Our brains are wired for modulation. Dopamine, endocannabinoids, and even endogenous DMT show that altered states are built into our biology. Historically, intoxication was embedded in ceremony and community, where meaning and structure prevented excess. Modernity stripped away that context. Ritual became recreation, pleasure became commodity, and the state reframed curiosity as pathology. The pleasure taboo, rooted in theology and in industrial discipline, turned ecstasy into sin, then disease, then crime. Addiction, in this view, is not alien but ancestral. The same drive for transcendence narrowed into repetition when meaning collapses. It is hijacked transcendence, curiosity without community, expansion without integration. The chapter closes by linking personal compulsion with political prohibition. Both are fear-based responses to uncertainty. The core argument is simple but radical. The urge to alter consciousness is natural. The problem is not the chemistry of curiosity, but what happens when culture disconnects it from ritual, relationship, and responsibility. And then chapter 4 will get on to the war on drugs.